Last week I went out to a property out here. This is just about 40 k's north of Gunnedah, and I was out there taking in just the serenity with some childhood mates of mine. This is right down there at the dam house. You can see it on the left. But about 5 years ago, I was with a buddy of mine named John, who I grew up with, went to school with, and we pulled up to the dam house. My friend Travis was already there. He was lying down doing some target shooting across the dam. And we rocked up in our truck and it was blowing a gale. Like, you know, the trees were on the angle doing the whole, look at me, I'm a used car salesman, advertisement, inflatable person, you know, out the front. The trees were doing that. It was chaotic. And John and I get out of the truck, we start unloading our gear and we start walking towards this dam house. We're, I guess, over here as the photo looks. And as we were walking, minding our own business, Travis, again, I could see him off in the distance, we just were not prepared for what happened next. This almighty bam! John and I fell over, got knocked on our backsides. All of our gear went everywhere, blinding light. I look up and it's just hooking wind, so I can barely hear anything. And John is doing on his all fours, you know, that chaotic kind of scramble to the house. I get up and I start running towards the house, and then Travis gets up and he starts running back. I hadn't actually said g'day to him yet, and he's there and he's like, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" And I was like, "What, the lightning?" He's like, "Yeah, it arced through the end of my rifle." Now, his stock was made of timber, luckily, so he didn't get electrocuted, struck by lightning. It arced out the end of his rifle. And so he's just shaking. I grab him on the shoulder and we're just kind of going up that ramp into this hut, and we're just like, what are we doing? This is nuts. It was insane. I don't know how far away the strike was, but it's pretty close, probably 10, 20 meters. Storms are so powerful. They're terrifying. They can be terrifying. Completely out of your control. And yet here's a paradox when it comes to storms. On the one hand, they're terrifying, but on the other hand, they can create beauty unlike any artist in this world. Terror and beauty all in one. And what we're going to be looking at today is, as Mel read out, a story of a storm. It was interesting, last week we had a guest come along from CCC Ost, who we're now affiliating with, Gav, and he happened to speak on a topical, and he chose to speak on a storm. A storm with Jesus in a boat with some of his mates, the disciples. Well, this week it's not Jesus, it's Paul, and it's not his mates. Well, there's two, but it's predominantly these other sailors and soldiers that are escorting him to Rome. If you've been tracking with us for the last 18 months, we are in the book of Acts. We have been for a while now, and we are calling this theme to the ends of the earth. We're nearly there, right? A couple more weeks to go. And Rome has been on the horizon of Paul's missionary work for a long time now, as he's been preaching the gospel since he first came to know Jesus on that Damascus road. If you read the letter of Romans, you see all throughout, it's very personal. He always says these things like, I long, I pray, I am eager, I plan, I hope. He actually wrote that letter on his third missionary journey, just a couple of chapters before where we are today in the book of Acts. Rome was always on his horizon. But remember, his friends warned him, because Paul said, before I go to Rome, I need to go back to Jerusalem to go to the feast. And his friends are like, oh, don't go there. You'll get arrested. And he's like, that's okay. If it happens, it happens. And sure enough, he got arrested. And now we're 2 years later, after he's been in prison and trialed after trial after trial. We've had Dan and Mick and Dirks take us through those various trials the last few weeks. If you've been here over the last month, we had the trial with Festus and the Roman governor, then Felix, another Roman governor, then King Agrippa, the Herod II, the local Jewish leader at the time as well. Mistrial after mistrial with weak or false evidence. Basically, Paul came to this perspective that, you know what, I'm getting the wrong end of the stick here, and I don't quite trust that I'm going to get a fair trial. So he appealed on the basis of his Roman citizenship to go to Caesar. Now, it's interesting because where Dirks left us off the other week, at the end of that last trial, it's kind of like King Agrippa is saying, Paul, like, I get why you appealed to Caesar, but, mate, there's honestly not much against you. So if you didn't appeal to Caesar, we could have just let you go. But you've appealed, so to Caesar you will go. Now, that's a long boat ride. Hence, we are now on this seagoing journey. This, by the way, is a relief. It was discovered by archaeologists that goes back to the 2nd century, right? And if you can see it there, it's a ship. It's probably the kind of ship that Paul was on there. It's quite interesting. This journey here in Acts 27, it's one of the most detailed, in fact, it is the most, as far as I'm aware, detailed account we have from antiquity of a seagoing journey. When you think of seagoing journeys in the ancient world, something like Homer's Odyssey might come to mind, which is very much mythology. What we have here is steeped in detail. It is a treasure chest of details for ancient historians. This has been mined and plundered. You find papers on it. People think they found the anchors that were dropped at Malta. So it's quite a fascinating, detailed account. And part of the reason why we have such detail here is because Luke, the author of the book of Acts, is on the boat. And we know that because of the little wee sections that are throughout this chapter as we move forward. But while this is a vividly detailed account of history and a true boat story, what I want to do today as we go through this is think about it metaphorically or spiritually as it relates to all of our lives. So we will go through the detail, but I want to extrapolate from that to apply it to all of us here, insofar as we all encounter storms as we sail through life. Like Paul, we all have our own stories of suffering and shipwreck. We have heartache, trouble, difficulty, grief. And so while this is a seriously gripping drama, like you can almost see the Netflix series coming out of this, it also carries deep spiritual lessons for us as well. And so we're going to navigate through those together. I've titled this talk, The Lord of/in the Storm. It's a very clunky title. So the Lord of the storm, who is in the storm. And we've got 3 points here by way of outline if you're taking notes. Providence, priorities, and perseverance. In a sentence, storms alter our course, forcing us to reevaluate life, leading to a deepened faith and hope. That's the big idea here. Now, let me just get something out of the way up front and then we'll get into it. Something that people like me, who tend to talk too much, learn very early on when they're starting out in ministry, is that when people are in the middle of a storm, when they're going through something, the last thing they want to hear from you is a 3-point sermon about providence, priorities, and perseverance. Don't rock up to their house and start throwing out your theological pearls. That's not... Well, you won't do it again if you do it once. People just want a hug. They just want to know that you care. Somebody to listen, pray, and just let them know that you're there. And yet, I am also deeply persuaded that a 3-point sermon like this is very important for all of us here. If not for ministering in the moment, then for equipping us before the moments come. Because a person at sea cannot navigate through a storm that they're not equipped to do so, right? We're actually going to see that here. Paul's like, don't let those sailors cut the boat and bail because we don't know how to sail this thing and we're all going to die if they go. So hence the soldiers cut the lifeboat and away it goes to stop the sailors from bailing. We need to be equipped before we get into the storms of life to know how to navigate through them, because when you're in them, it's not the time to start learning. You're holding on for survival. You're holding on for dear life. But we need to know what it is that we're holding on to. Right? So that's what today is all about. It's about giving biblical orientation to help us through the dark night of the soul toward that light on the horizon of hope. Providence, priorities, perseverance. Let's get into the first one here, providence. So picking up in verse 1. The story opens up here in chapter 27 with Paul at Caesarea. So here we are on the map. There's Rome in the top left. That's what they're trying to do. This shouldn't have that big dip in there, by the way, but that's the storm situation. We'll get there in a moment. We're down here in the bottom right-hand corner at Caesarea. Paul has been in prison for 2 years again, and we see here in the first couple of verses the details of the people and the ship that he's about to embark on. We're told in his opening verses that in addition to Paul, some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius were there. Luke, we've already discussed. He's the author of Acts, also a physician, likely tended to Paul. We also see, though, in verse 2 that they were accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian man from Thessalonica. And if you recall, he was actually one of Paul's companions on a previous missionary journey together. So altogether, they set in sail from Caesarea and they go up to Sidon, which is not that far north in modern-day Lebanon, where they put in for a brief amount of unspecified time. After Sidon, they then set out across open seas between Sicilia and Cyprus, arriving at this place named Myra of Lycia. Now, clearly, the fact that Paul has traveling companions here means he's probably not been treated like a regular criminal, okay? And that's indicated or implied, at least by Agrippa and previous Roman governors there, as they said, look, mate, you've appealed to Caesar, but you're a good dude. Go for it, all the best. So he's not really in shackles like the other prisoners. That's clear by virtue of verse 3, where he's treated kindly. So Paul is getting unique treatment, I guess, if you will, as they're going on this voyage. Now, real quick history here, because it's in Myra that they actually change boats. You can think of that like a connecting flight today. But real quick history here, the boat that they get on is called the boat from Alexandria, an Alexandrian ship. Now, in those days, there were no passenger boats. You couldn't just get on the local, Rome Express or whatever and head on across the Mediterranean to get to Rome. If you wanted to sail, you either jumped on board, likely you would jump on board with the trade ship. There were military ships as well, but you likely jumped on board with trade ships, and when you were on your way, you would basically work, keep your board and everything on there as you're going. Now, back then though, what was happening in the Roman Empire is the Romans, for political purposes, were giving free bread out to all of their citizens. And Alexandria in Egypt, so right down the bottom there, was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. So there was just a pipeline of continuous grain ships going from Alexandria all the way up to Rome at this period of time. This is one of those boats. We know that because down in verse 38, I think it is, we read that they threw the wheat overboard, and we're told here that it was a Alexandrian ship that they jump on. So this is one of those ships, and it was a massive ship, by the way. Here's a picture of what it would have looked like. This is a big ship. Probably can't quite get the perspective here. It was sturdy to withstand the might of the Mediterranean as they crossed over there. Held 276 people in total, at least on this voyage, as we heard Mel read out in verse 37. But with all of that said, it actually had a few weaknesses. For one, they didn't actually have a rudder to steer with. They just had these oars to try and angle themselves and move themselves forward. And for another, they only had one mainsail, which meant that they couldn't steer into the wind. You couldn't tack, so to speak. If you're in a storm, you just basically got driven along. This is why we start to see here in verse 4, the winds were against us. So leaving Myra now, they're starting to journey across to this little island of Crete. And we read verse 8, to a place called Fair Haven, which was near the city of Lasea. And verse 9, since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. Just to clarify that point there, that fast is the Day of Atonement in the Jewish calendar. It's Yom Kippur. It's the one day of the year where you fast if you're a Jew. And the reason why that little detail is significant here is because it tells us the time frame of when this voyage happened. We're now talking about mid-October, so things are starting to cool down in the Mediterranean. And anyone who sails in the Mediterranean knows to this day that you don't go sailing at this time of year. It's dangerous. It's wild weather, particularly as you approach winter. Hence, we read here, Paul advised them. Verse 10, sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss. Got to love the English translations. Yes, he said it this formally. He's probably local in his vernacular. Not only of the cargo, but also of our lives. Paul speaks up. He's not the centurion. He's not the captain. He's just a sort of not really criminal hitching a ride to Rome, but he is a preacher. And you know those preachers, they can be quite opinionated from time to time. But Paul's opinions here aren't without basis. After 3 missionary journeys, crisscrossing the Mediterranean, this guy knew a thing or two about sailing and what it was to be out in a storm. Read 2 Corinthians 11. Prior to this shipwreck, he had been shipwrecked 3 times, one of which he found himself floating adrift for a full day and night at sea. So Paul is giving a learned opinion here, okay? But as we read in verse 11, the centurion paid no attention to Paul, and he paid more attention to the pilot, the captain, and the owner of the ship. So Julius follows the advice of the experts, which, hey, that kind of makes sense, to be fair. And because the harbour, that's at Fair Havens here, was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbour of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So the longer they wait, okay, the more dangerous it's going to be to travel. Winter is coming. The sailors know this. The centurion, though, he listens to the captain, the boat owner, and they accept the risk and they want to cruise on to Phoenix. It's about 65 k's away, a good, solid 24-hour journey with, good weather and all the rest. But why are they pushing? Why are they flirting with fate, right? What's to gain by an extra day? Well, as nice as Fair Havens sounds, near the city of Lassie, turns out it's a bit of a hole. Like, if vanilla preacher boy Paul wants to bunk in and winter there, all power to you, man. But we sailor boys, we're going to head on around to Phoenix because there's something to do there at least. I was trying to think of some examples to give, but I'd probably offend somebody, so I'm going to avoid it. So they push on to Phoenix. Or at least they try to, okay? They're trying around the base of Crete there. And let me just read this section out. Verse 13. Now when the south wind blew gently, all is well. Supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. They actually have a name for this northeaster. It was known as a Euroclydon, a cyclonic, tempestuous northeastern wind that blows along the Mediterranean. I don't know if you heard last week, Gav dropped this little hint. There were very superstitious people back then when it came to the weather and the waves and the wind. So there was a whole significant kind of religious, mythological understanding of this northeaster, but we'll park that for now. This was a fierce wind, literally a hurricane kind of event that picked up. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, remember, because of the limitations of that ship, we gave way to it and were just driven along. Couldn't do anything about it. So they just let go and see what happens. So what should have been one day's journey between Fair Havens and Phoenix turns into disaster as this northeaster just blows them off course. Now, I want you to notice something here with the text we've gone through to this point. Notice that there has been a couple of key phrases here. Verse 4, the winds were against us. Verse 7, we sailed slowly with difficulty. Verse 8, coasting along with difficulty. Verse 9, the voyage was now dangerous. It's kind of boiling point. Verse 14, a tempestuous wind. Verse 15, we're done. We're just being driven along. Same again in verse 17 as well. Here's the first lesson I think we can pull from this storm story. Storms aren't comfortable. Spiritually or metaphorically speaking, they push us. They pull us. They pressure us. They knock us about. They knocked me and my mates to the ground, literally. Storms alter our course in life. We all sail through life with certain plans, expectations, dreams, goals. Even the person who says, I have no purpose, is meaning something when they make that very statement. Therefore, we all live with purpose. The fact you're here today in the chairs that you are signals some degree of purpose, even if you're not aware of it right now. We all move with purpose. We all have seasons of smooth sailing. The south wind blew gently. And supposing we've obtained our purpose, happy days, let's go for it. Let's go to Phoenix. And then wham, the northeaster comes and smacks us up the side and alters our course. And we can't do anything about it. Health. You just finished work. It's the Christmas holidays. You're ready to set off with the family. You've got the payments down. It's all booked. And you get a call from the doctor telling you that lump is not benign and you need to come in and we need to start talking about a way forward. Finances. You have a car accident. You thought your car was insured and then you remember it's on the counter at home. Hadn't paid it. Now you have a massive payment for a car you can't afford. Northeaster. Relationships. You thought you knew a person and they just flipped on you. And you're confused. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe it was your spouse. Maybe it's something that's happened that means that now the people in your family are having to deal with a situation that you never anticipated for, and it's costing you. Northeaster. Death. You're just driving home from work. That road that you've driven so many times, it's monotonous. That same road, that same traffic light where everyone's merging right and it's always backed up, and here you are with your indicator on. It's going to be a good 14 minutes before you get across it. You know it, you've done it. When all of a sudden you get a call and it's about your mum. It's about your friend. It's about your child. They've been killed in a freak accident. Now you don't even see the traffic. You don't even notice that the light has turned green. You don't even hear that the person behind you that's blaring the horn, because you've been so emotionally blown off course with that one phone call. That's what storms do. That's a northeaster. They're wild and they're uncontrollable. And let me tell you this, to find yourself completely out of control, well, you just can't do anything to change the situation, is horrible. It's horrible. It's terrifying to know that you actually cannot pay for this to fix it. You cannot change it. You cannot achieve an outcome to make this problem go away. You're completely helpless. You've been driven along. Storms are so powerful. But the lesson in here, there's many, but one of them is at least that it's a humbling lesson. You're at the mercy of a storm. We don't choose which course we take. We just get driven along. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, just live a little longer. Just wait. This is life. I'm not being a pessimist, I'm being a realist here. Job said it. From the very first breath, man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward, the little embers as the fire crackles. It's going to happen. And think about the story of Job, that big, long story in the Old Testament about Job. It's difficult to understand in some places, but the basic storyline is clear. Job was a prosperous man, upright man who experienced sudden and severe loss. He was hit with northeaster after northeaster after northeaster, lost his possessions, lost his children, lost his physical health, lost his mental health. His nameless wife told him to curse God and die. And his friends tempt him to think that all of this has happened because he's done something wrong. Hey, this is karma. If you get good, it's because you do good. If you get bad, it's because you've done bad. Job, you got bad. Therefore, bro, you've done something wrong. And Job's like, I know I'm not perfect, but there is nothing I can think of in my life that is warranting the kind of suffering that I'm going through right now. And so he starts to protest in his lament. And as he's doing that, it's very interesting. His anguish is in such soul that he's protesting towards God, but as he's doing it, he's fearful that if I was to summon him, God, and he was to answer me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice because he would just crush me with a storm. Interesting. And sure enough, Job does get that audience with heaven because God does rock up. Job 38:1. And what do we read there? The Lord answered Job out of the storm. Interesting. Have you ever noticed that God answered Job out of a storm? It's one of those details we just cruise over until, I do at least, until I have to prepare a talk like this. Why did God appear in a storm to Job? Well, we get a hint by the way God responds to Job's protests. He hits him with 60 plus impossible questions ranging from cosmology, ecology, zoology, reminding Job, you aren't in control of the way this world works. It's like God is saying, I hear your cry, that's why I'm here, but Job, you cannot domesticate providence. The universe is a big, complex place, far more than some simplistic karmic system. And you're not always going to understand what's going to happen to you. The rain falls on the just and the unjust, Jesus said a couple of centuries later. Sometimes the good guys are going to get hurt, sometimes the bad guys are going to get away with it, and you won't always be understanding why. But that's okay, because it's not your place to understand why, Job, because you aren't the Lord of the storm. I am. How do we know that? God doesn't declare it, but he demonstrates it in virtue of the fact that he is the Lord who appears in the storm. The Lord of the storm because he is the Lord in the storm. You see, what does that mean though, right? Well, for one, it means that God is sovereign over the sufferings we go through. And we see that here in this boat trip again. Just look at the list there. The Lord is constantly telling Paul, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. Don't worry. No one's going to get hurt. You're going to get to Rome. In other words, when the storms of life come, stopping us, changing us, altering our course from going one way to another, even though that might mess with our plans, it does mess with our expectations, our dreams, our hopes, our anticipations. It doesn't mess with God's. Because he is the Lord of the storm. We might not be able to see the bigger picture here. We might not be able to answer all of the questions that Job's getting hit with, but God can. That's the point of the rhetorical questions there with Job. You see, with the sudden change of direction, our little internal compass starts to spin. Where's north? Where's north? Which up? Which way's down? I don't know anymore. It's like when you're getting tumbled at the ocean after you've come off a big wave. It's freaky until you find your footing, you find your orientation, you can boost your way back up again. It's disorienting, can make you really, really anxious. But it's like God is saying, I'm still your north. Trust me, hold on to me, cast your anxieties upon me. I'm here and I care. C.S. Lewis wrote that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Storms alter our course, but recognizing the providence of God in it and finding the north, they force us to reevaluate really what matters in life. And that's the second point here. From providence to priorities. Look here at verse 16. Running under the lee of a small island called Clauda, that's the side of the sheltered side behind the wind of the island, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis sands, they lowered the gear and thus were driven along. So now they're just way off course. They were meant to be in Phoenix, didn't quite make it in time for the weekend. Now they're way over the top of where they think is probably North Africa, the sands there. It was a very dangerous place to be sailing. It was known for many, many shipwrecks. They didn't have GPS, obviously. They used to navigate by the stars back then, but as we read here in a moment, all the stars are out because we're in the middle of a big storm. So verse 18, we were being violently storm-tossed. They began the next day to jettison the cargo, and then on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither the sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay upon us, i.e., it was a big old storm, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Here's a second lesson that we get with storms. Not only do they alter our course, they force us to reevaluate our lives. We see that here in a number of ways. For one, they secure the ship's boat. That's the lifeboat, the dinghy that they used. And then they used the ropes of that once they got it on board to undergird the ship. It's called frapping. They use it to reinforce the hull. So it's creaking. They don't want it to split apart. So they're trying to reinforce it with whatever material they have. You almost can hear and see the movie, the wave, the winds, the dark. It's one of those where you're kind of trying to increase the brightness on your device to see exactly what's going on because it's just chaos at this moment. Desperate times, desperate measures. Second, they lower the gear. It's not exactly clear what that is. It could be the sail for the mainmast, or it could be their anchors. We're not quite sure. The point is they're trying to stop themselves from being driven along and smashing into this increasingly shallow in water that they're in. Third, they begin the next day to jettison the cargo, throwing the ship's tackle, that's all of the sailing gear, ropes and everything overboard with their own hands. Like John and I, we got nailed by the storm and everything just fell. We just left it all behind. You weren't even thinking about it at that point. In verse 38, we actually see they end up throwing the wheat into the sea. And that's the money, right? That's the precious cargo, not only for Rome, but even for their own survival if they were to get stuck out at sea for a long time. So they're throwing away their food in a last-ditch effort to try and save themselves. Storms cause us to reevaluate what matters the most in life. Sometimes the things that were the most important, the whole purpose of this entire journey, the cargo, just is not that important when you're looking at a grave. Storms invite these soldiers and sailors to change their values, and in the process they are becoming different people. They're now survivors. It's what storms do. There can be beauty and terror in a lightning strike. And in the same way, there can be clarity of purpose in all of this chaotic confusion. Because when you think about it, there was a very clear purpose in their mind as to what they should do. We need to get rid of all this stuff if we're going to live. It reminds me a little bit of my wife and I when we're leaving Oxford. It's very easy to look back on COVID and have all of our opinions, but when we were there, beginning of 2020, we were in the Oxford in the UK, just had a baby boy, our first child overseas all by ourselves, and this COVID thing was encroaching upon England. It took a while before it hit here. And the airports are shutting down, everyone's been told to stay at home. We didn't know what this was, we didn't know if we were going to die. It was all pretty scary, right? Particularly when we were away overseas. And I had these big hopes and dreams of being away for 5 years, pursuing a PhD and all of this stuff. I had it all mapped out, had my plans. And then COVID hits, global pandemic, and all of that just, who cares? I have a wife, I have a child, I want to go home, I want to be with my family. The PhD and all of that stuff, pipe dream stuff, you leave that behind. We literally left behind, jettisoned a lot of our cargo, just gave it away. Who cares about the coin? We're not going to waste time on Gumtree trying to get rid of that stuff. You know, we're literally in the last hire car out of Oxford before that shut down, onto the last flight out of Heathrow to be the first international flight ever flying direct to Australia. And then we're the first bus through hotel quarantine there on Macquarie Street in Sydney. You would have seen our faces glued to the bus windows on the news. When life gets stripped away to the bare essentials, suddenly it can become very clear as to what you should do and what matters the most. Usually it's proportional to the grief that you're having. C.S. Lewis said something like, if you want to see the true measure of a person, consider how they respond when you interrupt them. Well, if you want to know what a person really believes deep down in their hearts, consider how they go through suffering. Consider how they respond to a northeaster when that interrupts their lives. Storms are an expose on what you really believe about yourself and those around you and the world around you, which again is why we want to have a message, I think, like this impressed upon us so deeply so that it wells up in a moment of trial organically. And we see here with these soldiers, what did they have left? All hope was abandoned. Neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. When situations in life become so dire, there is a point at which people come to an end of themselves and their own resources and ability to save themselves. No more tackle or grain to throw overboard, no more ropes to tighten, no more things to do, only resignation to the fact that this thing is going down. It's resignation to despair. Hopelessness. You see, when storms hit us in life, they force us to rethink what's truly important. You might, again, be throwing away the things that used to be so valuable to you because they simply just are not that important. There is a clarity that comes in the chaos. But if everything that we value in life is on the boat, it shows the limitations of our values, doesn't it? You see, the pointy end of this second lesson is that storms come, they alter our course, forcing us to reevaluate life, and in the process, they wake us up to this veil of illusion, particularly here in the West, this idea that we're going to live forever. We know we're going to die, we all know that, but we don't live like that. Like if you knew that you're going to die at 3:48 p.m. this Tuesday, what would you do tonight? Would you go to work in the morning? Like, what would your priorities be? On the threshold of despair and hopelessness and eternity and death, the things of this world grow strangely dim, and when that happens, just like the clarity that I had in needing to bug out of the UK, it becomes obvious that the things that occupy so much of our time, the arguments that we have about the dishes and all of that silly, is just not that important. Ultimately, it's God or nothing. Because on the boat, all is hope abandoned. That's all we've got. If we're to persevere, if we're to put our faith in something, have a value, a hope, it has to be in something beyond the boat, because that's where the salvation is. Otherwise, we're just shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, watching this sucker go down. So from Providence to priorities, to perseverance. This is the third and final point here. Storms alter our course, forcing us to reevaluate life, leading to a deepened faith and hope. Look here at 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred the injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God had granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island,'" which is what happened, verse 44, as they hit the beaches of Malta. Now, it's interesting. There are kind of two resignations going on here. You have the sailors and the soldiers who are resigned to hopelessness and despair. And then you have, by contrast, Paul and presumably Luke and Aristarchus, who are resigned to hopeful providence. And we see that here in these couple of verses, 24 and 25, how infectious that hope is. It just exudes out of Paul in encouragement to these sailors, which is remarkable. Do not be afraid. God has granted the lives of everyone on board, so take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. What's the basis of Paul's hope? Well, it can't be anything or anyone on the boat, because that's where there is no hope. The basis of Paul's hope is verse 23, the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. That's ownership language. That's service language. That's actually covenant language there. A few weeks ago, I was locked in a really intense conversation with this bloke for 2 hours who was questioning Christianity, and he just had this real concern with faith. This very, very sharp guy from Melbourne. And he was asking all of these questions like, how much faith do I need? Is it 40%? Is it 68%? Is it 99%? How do you measure that? How do you know if you have enough? And hypothetical scenario after hypothetical scenario. I was trying to process this with him, and it got to this point where I said, mate, I think we're trying to answer a mistaken question here. Faith is not a consumer transaction that you measure by percentage in the economy of God. It's a covenant-bound conviction to the things that God has said, which you can know by what he's done. It's not about how much or how little faith you have. If it were, that would make it all about you. Jesus said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, speak to this mountain and watch it move in my name. Christians do not have faith in their faith or their ability to have enough faith. That would make us our own saviors. The ground of all human salvation before God is not a percentage, it's not a math equation, it is not an intensity of faith, it is the object of our faith, Jesus Christ. That's what matters. The piece of paper that you have for a check, if we deal with those anymore, it's not the value in the piece of the paper, it's what it points to, it's the money in the bank. Same with Jesus Christ. It's not our faith, it's who the object of our faith is. In this case, the Lord of the storm. Paul is putting his faith not in himself for his own ability or the strengthening of the hull by their frapping efforts. It was in the Lord of the storm who had the bigger picture, which reminds us of Job again, doesn't it? Trust me, Job, I have the bigger picture here. But why trust God just because he has a bigger picture, David? Sometimes I ask myself these things in the office out loud. I externalize it. My wife hears it all the time. Did you call me? No, it's just me talking to me. God is sovereign over a storm. Who cares? So what? How does that help me right now, David? I'm going through some stuff. In fact, isn't that just adding insult to injury? Because here I am hurting, and if he's Mr. Sovereign, he's not really doing anything about it, is he? Remember that Job feared that if God were to show up, he'd destroy him with a storm for his protests. And God does show up, but he doesn't destroy Job. He asks him some hard questions, impossible questions. But to Job's protests, look at what God says. The Lord answered Job out of the storm. Now that's a little clue. You see, there's a Hebrew idiom: to speak to someone is for a superior to speak to an underling. It's a one-way dictation of communication, a one-way arrow of authority to an inferior. But here in Job 38:1, God doesn't speak to Job. The Lord answered Job. So not only does he not rock up in a storm and destroy him, not only does he not rock up and speak to him, he answers him. In other words, when God shows up as the Lord of the storm in the storm, it's not to condemn Job, it's to commune with him, to have a conversation, co-togetherness. He's on the same level, he's getting beside him, which is incredible when you read the questions that this Lord of the storm was asking Job there, 60 plus. Read Job 38:39. In fact, when you get to the end there, you see that God even gives Job the final word. It's remarkable. Condescension on the part of God. God is so sovereign over suffering, and yet he is so low in subjecting himself to us in our suffering. And we see that there with Job. So what? God's sovereign, so what? Who cares? Why isn't he doing anything about it? Well, he's involved in it in some way. And this takes us obviously to the cross with Jesus. And what we see there is God working all things to the good of those who love him, which is actually something Paul says in Romans chapter 8. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for the purpose of those who are called. Now be careful with this though, because Paul is not saying that everything is good. He's not saying that every storm cloud has a silver lining. He's not saying that you just need to be all stoic, force yourself to see, in your suffering this different angles so that you can go, it's actually a really good thing, even though I don't feel it. No, suffering is not good. Don't pretend that it is, and do not come to me and tell me that it's going to all be okay when it just is. It's not. It's terrible. It's grief. It's heartache. It's gut-wrenching, and it's horrible. The mistake of Job's friends was that they opened up their mouths. Just be with people when they grieve. What Paul is saying here in Romans chapter 8, though, is that all things, whether good or terrible, all things work together so that from God's perspective, which is something that only God has, everything will achieve the opposite of what evil intended. Now, how is that the case for Job? Well, part of the answer was given in the details of Job, where there is restoration in his life, but the other part of the answer is given in the very fact of the book itself. I mean, at the beginning of the book of Job, you have Satan coming to God intending evil. But in the end, what was accomplished? Satan was instrumental in the composition of a book that has ironically helped hundreds of millions of people around our world in the midst of suffering trust in God. Evil was intended. Good was achieved. We say the same thing. You see the same thing with Joseph, countless others throughout the Old Testament. But obviously, again, we get to the heart of the matter in Jesus. God incarnate who was killed on a cross. And his disciples, like these sailors and these soldiers, found themselves in complete despair, hopelessness, until that Easter morning when the angel rocks up and says, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is not here, he's risen." For all of the passion, the death of Jesus accomplished the exact opposite of what was intended. It accomplished salvation for the world. So Job, Joseph, Jesus, Paul, my friends Amy and Sam, who lost their little baby less than a month old, I'll never forget it. Julie and I are with them in their lounge room, and Amy, through tears, was grieving. And she said, "I hate that this happened. I wish it never happened. And yet, I never want to go back to knowing God the way I knew him before." There is intimacy in suffering. Job, Joseph, Jesus, Paul, Sam, Amy, you. When a northeaster comes your way, when your course is altered, when you reevaluate life, you can deepen your faith and have a greater hope through it all. Doesn't mean the hurt isn't there, doesn't mean that you wish it never happened, but it can be deepened in the moment of hurt. You see, where Job reminds us that from God's providence, he has the bigger picture. He's working all things to good, even though we can't see it. Jesus reminds us that he is in the middle of that picture. And you see what that means? That means that even though you can't see the bigger picture because you're not sovereign, you're not the Lord of the storm, that tells us in the least that that picture can't mean that God doesn't love you because he's in the middle of it. That makes sense? If two people have cancer and God decides to heal one person and the other one dies, God's providence in that says nothing about whether God loves one more than the other. Don't tell me that when I'm hurting and that's me or my spouse. Do not tell me that. But you need to know this before then, right? God's providence says nothing about whether or not he loves one of them more than the other, because the way you know whether God loves you is not whether you live to be 99 years old in a comfortable house with all your friends and your family around you. It's whether or not he hung on a cross. And the answer to that question was given 2,000 years ago, and you can check it out. It's a reasonable hope that we have. It's open to your investigation. I mean, why is it that almost no one around today says, I don't believe in God because Jesus died on a cross? Like, that's why I'm not going to come to church because Jesus died on a cross. Almost no one says that because we all know that in the very heart of the gospel message is what was intended for evil, God meant for good, right? This dance of intended for evil and God working it out together for good is the very movement of our Christian salvation. So how long are we going to go through life wondering whether or not God cares about me enough, whether or not he loves me because I'm going through something, when in Jesus Christ you've already got the answer to that question? So turn your eyes upon Jesus as we sing. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of this earth, the storms, the wind, the waves, the cancer will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. They're going to hurt, they'll still be there. But you can see him and have your north and your orientation to move through. Like, this is something unique about Christianity, by the way. The whole idea of a God suffering is foreign to any other worldview out there or religion out there. This is uniquely Christian. That God is with us, that God can sympathize with us in the lowest of all human places, namely death. In our society today, so much time and money is spent trying to figure out ways to avoid suffering. Try and drug it, institutionalize it, pathologize it, surgically excise it, euthanize it, divorce it, do anything but live with it. Jesus Christ teaches you how to live with it. Remember Peter, Matthew 14, Sea of Galilee, another storm whips up, climbs out of that boat, walks over towards Jesus, the Lord of the storm. How do we know that? Because he's walking on the water. Then Peter takes his eyes off of Jesus, puts them onto the crashing waves, and he begins to doubt, to resign himself to the fear of the storm. He begins to sink. He's driven down by the waves like these soldiers and sailors. It's terrifying. But in that moment, in the hurt, in the fear, the Lord of the storm is there in the storm, and he reaches down and he pulls him up. Fear God and you won't have cause to fear anything else, least of all death. And everything I'm saying here about God's direct presence, again, is just something you do not get anywhere outside of this book. Have you ever been betrayed? So has Jesus. Do you have pain in your body? God knows what that's like. Have you lost your friends? Have you been unjustly treated? So has he. Amy and Sam lost a son. God lost a son. His love in time past forbids me to think he'll leave me at last in trouble to sink. Each sweet Ebenezer I have in review confirms his good pleasure to help me quite through. So providence, priorities, perseverance. Storms alter our course, forcing us to reevaluate life, leading to a deepened faith and hope. There is so much more here. But just let me say this. This is what enabled Paul to stand up in the dark, like a light shining in a dark place, when all hope was lost and he was full of hope. I mean, the rest of this, was he scared? Yeah, no doubt. Who wouldn't be? Was he hurt? Most likely. There were injuries here. But did he abandon hope? No. To the contrary, he was so full of hope that it spilled out of him. It was infectious in encouragement and exhortation. To the rest of this chapter, right to the end, it's hope all the way. It's hope all the way. Just like the trials at Caesarea, this shipwreck at Malta was flipped into a moment of evangelism. There's even a communion service, by the way. That's a whole sermon, the Lord's Supper in the middle of the storm. So there's hurt, but there's hope. Paul goes from being captive to captain. They didn't listen to him before. They're all listening to him now. So friends, let me just say this by way of parting. People are watching your life. People are watching you when you suffer. And the way you suffer is going to give lip service to the hope that you do or don't have inside. So if you're a Christian, what testimony to God are you giving when you suffer? And if you're not, where's your value? What do you have? Anything off the boat? I want to be like Paul, not the sailors or the soldiers, full of faith and hope. I want to be like Jesus, who went to the cross, scorning its shame. Storms can be terrifying, and yet they can create these moments of beauty. And I think that's what I want to land with today as we reflect on all of this in the providence of God. Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your God in heaven. Don't waste your suffering, hey? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we recognize you here as the Lord of the storm. And we look at a story like this and we are just reminded of your presence and your purpose in the middle of storms, even when we don't get it. Father, help us to see with clarity what ultimately matters in those moments, that we don't choose the moments that come necessarily, but we can choose how to respond in faith, and may it be one that gives testimony to the God it is that we worship. Father, help us with our difficulties. Help us to impress what is true, good, and beautiful as it concerns our salvation so deep within our souls that the waters of your word just well up in moments of despair, that we would keep our eyes fixed on you. And Father, we confess that we often struggle to understand the reasons for our suffering, and yet we know that you are sovereign over it, you are ever present, and you have the power to reorient our priorities, to strip away what's unnecessary and preserve us with a deeper faith and hope in you until we reach those golden shores of immortality. God, my faith has found a resting place in you, not a device, not a creed. I trust you, the everlasting. You're off the boat. And Jesus, your wounds for me I plead. There's no argument, no other plea. It's just enough that you died and that you died for me. May it be so for everyone here, Father, so that we can recognize in the dark of night that there is always a light on the horizon. Because that's the cross, the darkest day, and yet the most beautiful day. Good Friday's good because of Resurrection Sunday, the great turnaround. Father, turn us around now as we walk out these doors to be people so impressed and overwhelmed by who you are and what you've done in Jesus that, Lord, life, death, all looks different. We commit it to you, Lord, in the powerful name of Jesus.